My name is Captain Tyler Brooks. I'm 41 years old and I've served in the United States Army for nearly 2 decades. Most of those years were spent overseas, some in places I still can't talk about, and a few that changed who I thought I was for good. I come from a long line of soldiers. My father, Richard Brooks, served 2 tours in Vietnam and carried the weight of it long after the war ended. He wasn't much of a talker, but the way he carried himself, the quiet discipline in every move, said more than words ever could. When he passed, the only thing he left me personally was his Colt 1911. It's an old steel beast, worn along the grip from decades of use. He told me once that it saved his life, and I never doubted it. I keep it in a wooden box lined with green felt, next to the flag from his funeral. I don't know why, but lately I've been looking at that box more often. Sometimes I wake up thinking I hear him pacing the kitchen like he used to before sunrise. Sometimes I feel like something's coming, not from the outside, from home. There's a heaviness in the air I can't explain. I thought war changed me. I thought I'd already seen the worst of people. But the things I was about to learn, buried right here in my own family, would test me in ways no battlefield ever could. The day after my father's funeral, the house felt too quiet. The folded flag still sat on the mantel, untouched since the burial, and no one really knew what to say. Grief has a strange way of making people retreat into themselves, but in my family, we'd been doing that long before he passed. Evan, my younger brother, showed up late to the service, smelling like whiskey and too much cologne. He gave a sloppy speech about honor and sacrifice, then disappeared halfway through the reception. That wasn't new. Evan had always been the kind of man who wanted the reward without the work, and somehow, he blamed me for every opportunity he thought he missed. Amanda barely spoke that day. She stood beside me like a shadow, nodding to strangers and offering tight smiles, but I could feel her mind drifting. Once, I caught her staring at the floor, while Evan talked in the kitchen. Her eyes narrowed like she was listening for something only she could hear. I brushed it off. At the time, I was too tired to think it meant anything. Things between Amanda and me hadn't been simple for a while. She used to be an army nurse, brave, brilliant, always 5 steps ahead of me. But civilian life dulled her. She said I couldn't understand how hard it was, raising a kid while I deployed every year, coming home to bills and broken faucets. She'd call me a hero with one breath and roll her eyes the next. Evan liked to fuel that. He'd nudge her at family dinners, joke about how I lived in a fantasy world built on medals and old uniforms. She laughed louder than she needed to. I saw it. I didn't want to believe it meant anything. I didn't want to believe they were bonding over disappointment. Looking back, there were cracks in the floor long before the house fell. I just never thought the collapse would start from inside. It started with the noise a drawer shouldn't make. I was in Dad's study, clearing out old manuals and photo albums, when I pulled open the middle drawer and something clinked underneath. At first, I thought it was just a screw or paperclip caught behind the lining, but when I reached in and felt the edge of a false bottom, my pulse jumped. It took me a few seconds to pry it loose. Inside was a sealed manila envelope with my name scrawled in my father's tight, upright handwriting. Taped beneath it was a small brass key, like the kind used for a lockbox. I sat down on the floor without even realizing it and opened the envelope. The first thing I pulled out was a handwritten letter from my mom. Her penmanship hadn't changed since high school. She started by saying she was sorry. She always hoped she'd have the strength to tell me in person, but feared she never would. Then she got to the part that stopped everything. She wrote that Evan had convinced her to skip her last appointment, saying the side effects of chemo were worse than the cancer. He'd taken over her medications, adjusted her dosages twice without telling her doctor, and when she confronted him, he told her it was for her own good. She wrote that she didn't feel safe, not around him, not anymore. There was a second envelope inside the larger one. It held scanned copies of signed contracts from our family business restaurant agreements, property titles, power of attorney papers. My name was nowhere on them, but Evan's was stamped on every single page. There were multiple amendments filed just 2 months before she died, all transferring shares and assets into Evan's name. None of it had been notarized properly. Some signatures didn't even match her handwriting. I felt sick. I knew Evan had always been good with numbers and charm, but this wasn't clever accounting. This was theft. Maybe worse. I remembered her hands trembling those last few weeks. I thought it was the illness. Now I wasn't so sure. There was one more document in the envelope. A printout of a bank transfer. It showed $145,000 moving from her private account into an investment fund, managed by a shell company I'd never heard of. The account holder was listed under Amanda's maiden name. That hit me harder than the rest. I stared at the paper for a long time, willing it to mean something else. I picked up the phone and called Jeff Garrison, a friend from my second tour who became a JAG lawyer. He answered on the second ring, and I didn't even say hello. I just said, I found something. I think my brother's been stealing from our parents, and I think my wife knew. Jeff asked me to scan everything. He said he'd loop in a forensic accountant he trusted and check the legality of the transfers. While I waited, I went back to that drawer and pulled everything out again. I needed to be sure I hadn't missed anything. I needed this to make sense, to be explainable, even if it hurt. But the more I read, the worse it looked. My father's will had never been updated. His military pension was meant to be split evenly between his sons. And yet, every document in that hidden stash pointed to a plan that left me with nothing. Worse than nothing. Betrayal. I wasn't angry yet. That came later. First, there was only disbelief. Then this dull, rising pressure in my chest like I was about to break something just to hear it shatter. My whole life, I thought I understood what sacrifice meant. But no battlefield prepares you for being ambushed in your own home. Jeff didn't waste time. Within 2 days, he called me back with a tone I hadn't heard since Kandahar. He said the documents looked bad. Really bad. Enough for probable cause if someone took a closer look. He advised me to go straight to the feds. I told him I wasn't ready. He said it's not about ready. It's about right. I spent that night sitting in my truck outside the house, gripping the Colt my dad left me, feeling every memory of him pressed down on my chest. He raised us on integrity, on doing the hard thing when the easy way was right there. That gun saved his life in war. I was about to use his name to fight a war of my own. The next morning, I made the call. I contacted a local field office and asked to speak to someone in white-collar crimes. They put me through to a special agent named McAdams, who asked a lot of careful questions. I told him I had documents showing financial fraud, medical negligence, and a trail that might tie into healthcare abuse and tax evasion. He asked me to meet him in person. At our meeting, I handed over every piece of paper I'd found. The letters, the contracts, the suspicious transfers. He took notes, barely blinking. When I mentioned the chemo dosages being adjusted without the doctor's knowledge, he asked if I could get medical records. I said yes. Amanda still had remote access from her old credentials at the hospital. That part hurt to say out loud. I didn't know how long it would take. Investigations like this can drag on for years. But less than a week later, McAdams called and told me they were opening a formal case. Apparently, the shell company wasn't that well hidden. The accountant Jeff had looped in found connections to 3 other entities registered in states where Evan had once done consulting work. One of those entities had transferred funds directly into an account under Amanda's name. That was when I stopped sleeping. I kept working during the day, volunteering at the local vet center, pretending I still had some version of a normal life. But every night, I sat in that study, staring at the empty drawer where the secrets had come from. I imagined my mom writing that letter, hands trembling, trusting that one day I'd find it, that I'd do the right thing. A month passed, then another, and just when I started to believe maybe nothing would happen, McAdams called again. He asked me if I wanted to be there. I didn't know what he meant. He clarified. They were serving a warrant. He thought I'd want to see it. The restaurant was having a grand reopening under Evan's new management. Press releases went out. Local food critics, Chamber of Commerce. It was the kind of event Evan lived for. Spotlight, applause, the illusion of earned success. I stood across the street in plain clothes, arms folded, watching through the windows. Amanda was there too, dressed sharp, smiling like nothing was wrong. Like she wasn't tied to the bank account that held stolen money. Like she hadn't kissed my brother in my kitchen 2 weeks after the funeral when she thought I was asleep. McAdams walked in with 2 other agents. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the change in Evan's face. First confusion, then anger, then panic. They cuffed him in front of the cameras. I saw 3 cell phones go up at once, recording. One local news guy even zoomed in. Amanda's smile collapsed. She tried to walk toward the agents, but they blocked her. She wasn't arrested, not that day, but she was definitely named in the report. I heard later they froze her accounts. She packed a bag and disappeared the next week. I haven't seen her since. The next few weeks were a blur of depositions, affidavits, and cold interviews in gray rooms. The case was strong: fraud, theft, elder abuse, and yes, potential homicide by neglect. The DA wasn't sure they could prove the chemo tampering beyond reasonable doubt, but it was enough to add pressure. Evan took a deal. 22 years without parole. He cried in court, not for Mom, not for what he'd done, for himself. The restaurant was awarded back to the estate, all assets seized. I didn't even have to fight for it. It came to me by default, not because I wanted it, because no one else could hold it without dishonoring everything my parents built. That night, I walked into the kitchen alone. The lights were off. I stood by the old stove where Mom used to hum while stirring sauce, where Dad once cleaned his boots after work. I set the Colt down on the counter, not as a threat, as a tribute. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always roar in like a hero. Sometimes it shows up in quiet rooms, in signed papers, in wrists clicking behind backs. Sometimes it just looks like a man watching his brother get taken away, knowing he did what had to be done. The first time I unlocked the restaurant after the court transferred it back to the family estate, I stood at the front door for nearly 10 minutes without turning the knob. The sun hadn't even come up yet, and the parking lot was still wet from a night of light rain. I could hear birds waking up and the hum of the streetlight above me. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. It felt like walking into a memory I wasn't sure I wanted to relive. Inside, everything looked the same, but it felt different. Evan had remodeled, sure. Sleeker countertops, brighter lighting, modern chairs that didn't match the soul of the place. But I still saw the cracks in the tiles my dad refused to fix because he said they gave the place character. I still smelled the faint trace of garlic and rosemary in the walls. I heard my mother's voice even though I knew she was gone. I walked back to the kitchen. Same stove, same burner that always flickered until you hit it just right. I stood there for a long while, hand on the edge of the counter where Mom used to lean while quizzing me on military history like it was some family game. She'd stir a pot with one hand and recite dates and battles with the other. I was maybe 9 when I realized she knew more about war than most of my commanding officers ever would. That kitchen was her world. It was where she created warmth out of canned tomatoes and burnt bread, where she patched up scraped knees and broken hearts, where she made peace in a house full of silence. I used to think her greatest strength was patience. Now I think it was courage. The kind of courage that keeps you loving people who don't always deserve it. Owning that restaurant again didn't make me feel rich. It made me feel responsible, for her memory, for her name, for the truth she trusted me to carry. When the judge read the verdict, I didn't feel relief. I felt the weight of being the last one left to guard what she built. People ask why I didn't sell it, why I didn't just take the insurance money and walk away. I don't have a perfect answer. All I know is, there's something sacred about wiping down the same counter your mother once cried over. Something healing about making coffee in a pot she refused to replace, even when it cracked. I kept that old pot, by the way. Glued it back together. It still works. Some days are harder than others. There are mornings I open the door and swear I'll find her at the register. There are nights I dream of her slipping me another letter with her crooked handwriting and a knowing smile. But most days, I feel her in the rhythm of the place. In the sound of the kitchen fan clicking on. in the smell of baked bread rising before the lunch crowd, in the quiet kind of peace that doesn't come from justice, but from knowing you did right by someone you loved. Amanda never reached out. Not once. I don't know where she went. I don't really care. Evan sent a letter from rehab 3 months after the arrest. Said he was sorry. Said he didn't know how far it had gone. I don't know if I believe him, but I wrote back. Just a few words. I told him the door wasn't open, but the light was on. I don't hate him. I just can't let him in. The truth is, the hardest part wasn't losing my brother. It was realizing I never really had him. What I had was an idea. A story I told myself so I could believe we were a family. But real family shows up. Real family doesn't lie on legal documents and poison the people who raised them. Real family tells the truth even when it costs them everything. I've had time to think about what my mom left behind. It wasn't money, it wasn't property. It wasn't a legacy in the way people like to define it. What she left was a choice to stay silent or speak, to hide or to fight, to forget or to remember. She chose me to remember. So now, every time I lock up at night, I whisper thank you to the quiet walls. Every time I light the kitchen burner, I think about the courage it took for her to write that letter, to trust that someone would read it, to believe her voice still mattered. And it did. Mom's greatest gift wasn't in her will. It was in her trust.